Thank you for joining me for Session 7 of the Lifeway study of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy. The text is Numbers 33, verses 50 to 56, and chapter 34, verse 13 to 15. The title is Instructions Given, and the lesson summary statement says God's plans require believers to act on the instructions He gives. I'm using this suggestion that's found at Explore the Bible, the additional idea to start a lesson. And I'm going to write on the board the question that you'll find at that site. When did you first start using a smartphone? How has your phone use changed since those early days? I want to use that so that as the people come into the class, they see it, they read it, the mind begins to move in that direction, and so that they'll have some responses already when I begin to start the class. And then the article talks about information that results from a study that was done when people didn't use iPhones for 2 weeks. They disconnected from the internet and the positive benefits they had for them. So that's what I'm going to use, and you can find more information on that idea at Explore the Bible. The lesson is about warnings God gave Israel about dangerous distractions in the Promised Land. Idolaters who are allowed to remain in the land, he says, will become barbs for their eyes and thorns for their side. So this is a lesson about warnings and its importance to obey. Now, before we move any further, since this is the last lesson in Numbers, I want to do a little bit of a review, and I'd like for the class to have something of a bit of understanding about numbers. I want them to be able to go away from our study of numbers and have a body of information that makes them feel like they understand the book better after having spent several weeks in it. For example, I'm going to ask them, why is the book named Numbers? And of course, it got its name because of the two census. The census at the beginning of the book of the first generation, the faithless generation that died in the wilderness. And then it got its name because of the second census that was taken of the new generation that's going to go into the Promised Land. I'm going to ask them, well, where did the events take place? And of course, the events of Numbers take place in the wilderness. And what was the approximate length of time? Well, they should understand that because it's 40 years. That's how long they were going to stay in the wilderness till the first generation died off. And then just name some memorable events that took place that we have studied or that they have read about that. And so my hope is that when they get through with Numbers, they'll have a better grasp of their understanding of the book of Numbers. And then I want to take them and have them look at this lesson summary statement. This is a very powerful lesson summary statement. Again, let me point it out to you. God's plans require believers to act on the instructions He gives. Now, God's plans, we're talking about God's will. It's His intentional purpose and design for our lives. And notice the word require. He has the right to ask this, and He has the authority to ask this. It doesn't say that God's plans that He suggests to believers. It doesn't say these are what He expects of believers. It doesn't say this is what He desires for believers. It doesn't say this is what God implies for believers to do in terms of their obedience. No, we're talking about the living God, Almighty God, and God requires. He has the authority to ask us to do that. And why wouldn't He require it? Because His plans are perfect. His plans are what's best for us. His plans are what bring Him glory. And notice it says that they are to act. Now they may be fearful, but they're still supposed to act. They may be tempted to procrastinate, but they're not to procrastinate. They are to act. They may want to argue with Him about what His instructions are for them, but they're supposed to act. God's plans require believers to act. And what is it they're acting on? They're acting on the instructions He gives. Not my ideas, not your ideas, but God's ideas, what He says. And so we're to be able to know those things, and then we're to be carrying those things out. they're going to face many surprises. And some of those surprises they could never anticipate. So what do they need to do to plan for a future like that? A future of surprises, a future of things that they would never anticipate. How do they respond to that future? Well, these things don't catch God by surprise, and our best decision to make for the future is to act on the instructions that God gives. And so we are to do that minute by minute. In this minute, just act on the instructions as you understand that God gives. And then in the next minute, do the same thing. And minute by minute, moment by moment, we will arrive at God's plans that He has for our lives, the fullness of it. Now on on page 80, they give a review of the chapters. And you may want to spend some time, just a short time, and just mention what those things are. But what you see, they are all tied to the land and to the importance of the land. And that's going to lead into this discussion that if they're going to keep the land, then they need to be obedient. Even if you don't go through all of those passages. For example, it says in Numbers 28 and 29, it talks about Israel's regular offerings. If they're going to keep the land, they need to know the kind of offerings that are God-honoring and glorifying. It talks about in chapter 30, the vows. If they're going to keep the land, they need to be people who keep their word. But chapter 33, we come into the middle of chapter 33 in this lesson. And so in those first 49 verses, it does something that to us is extremely boring. It lists about 40 different locations that the people had gone through and camped during those 40 years. And we read those things, and archaeologists have been able to find some of them, and others they can't find, which makes sense since these people were nomadic and they didn't typically stay at places that had permanent buildings and so forth. But what is the point of Moses? Why is he doing that? Why is he listing these places they went through? Well, each of those are reminders of their travels through the wilderness. And in those travels, God provided for them, God cared for them, God's presence was with them each step of the way. And so a listing of these names, and we know that this is not all of the names. There are other texts that bring up different names that are not listed here. But that listing of those names brings memories to the people that this is a God who cares and provides and is present with them. And it is to encourage them to obey God's instructions. Now, you and I have the same thing. We can look back over our history and we can call out names or we can call out events, and those things will bring memories back to us. For example, I'm old enough to remember Vietnam. I was a young boy when my uncle went off to Vietnam. I have memories of that and praying for his safety. Then there are the Iranian hostages. I was a young man when that took place, and I have all kinds of stories that I could tell about what was going through the American culture when those Iranian hostages were held for 444 days. And then here in Oklahoma, we had the oil bust in the 1980s, and we know that it started with a bank called Penn Square Bank. And I can tell you many stories, many memories of the kind of hardship the oil bust brought to Oklahoma. And then, of course, there's 9/11. And so you see, we do the same thing. We can recall names or events or locations, and each of those things have memories of God's power and God's presence and God's provision in those times. And that's what's happening here. Now, these chapters that precede, they're chapters that provide God's instructions to the Israelites on how they are to occupy the land of promise. And we're going to read the promises God made to Israel if they would be faithful in their obedience. And so as we look at these verses, reflect on how important obedience to God is for the health of our church, as well as for our own spiritual growth. This is a very good lesson. This is a lesson that is going to get at one of the most fundamental that's necessary for the spiritual health of your class members, and that is their obedience. They need to understand this central lesson that God's plans, which are perfect, require them to act on the instructions that He gives them, and in that there is great blessings. So let's look at the text. The first is the land, Numbers 33 verses 50 through 53. What I want to do is, on the board, I'm going to draw a big circle, and I'm going to say, this is the promised land. This is what God wants to give them. This is the fullness of His plan, His great blessing that He wants to bring upon the Israelites. But for them to have that fullness, to have that blessing, there are some things that they are required to act on in regard to God's instructions. And so I want to read the text, and I want to ask the class, while we read this, I want you to look for the things. What are they to do? Because He's made this promise to them. I'm giving you this land. But for you to possess it and to know the full blessing of it, you need to follow my instructions. And so I'm asking them to look for that. And then that's going to give me an opportunity to expand on the understanding of it. Just to give you a few ideas. Notice in verse 50, the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. There's just so much detail in that passage. Notice, it's the Lord speaking to Moses. So the message that Israelites are going to get is not a message from Moses. This is a message from God. That's the kind of authority that it has with them. And notice how memorable this was. He says that this happened in the plains of Moab. This is right across from Jericho, he said, and it's right there next to Jordan. So it was one of those memories that he remembered so much detail about it. And so verse 51 is he gives them the message God says to them. Tell the Israelites when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan. Now notice the certainty. When you cross the Jordan. They arrive at the Jordan at the time of spring. I mentioned this once before, but the Jordan River is at flood stage at this time. Now, when it's not in flood, it meanders about 100 miles, and in some places it's marshy. But at the flood stage, the river is roaring, and that 100 miles is shrunk to about 55 to 60 miles. And they tell us that the Jordan is rolling so fast that it actually has rolled boulders down the Jordan River. And the word Jordan means descender. So it's talking about how fast the river would move. So the Sea of Galilee, you can look up the elevation. It's like 1,300 feet above sea level, and then it flows down into the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on earth. And in that 60 miles during flood space, it is really making headway. So when he says to them, you will cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, it's going to take a miracle to do that. Now notice verse 52, you must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their stone images and cast images, and demolish all their high places. Your commentary in your leader's guide will talk about those words. Just something that might be of interest to you, the words drive and the word demolish. Let me make certain about this. The word cross and the word demolish are in a Hebrew text that is called the Hiphil, and it means to cause to break. So he's saying, you're going to be the ones that need to do this. I'm going to give you the land, but you need to take action that you cross the Jordan, and you need to take action that you demolish these high places. Now, the word drive and the word destroy are in a different Hebrew tense called the PL, and it means an intensity. They are to be very aggressive in doing this. And one way that these different tenses were explained is the PL means to shatter, and the Hifil would mean to cause to break. But the point is, these are very intense, and he wants them to be giving strong effort to removing every aspect of the Canaanite culture from the land. Now notice the last verse, verse 53. You are to take possession of the land. That means it's not their own. God owns this land, and so He's going to give them to it. But you're to take possession of the land, settle in it, because I have given you the land to possess. Now consider for a moment how changed Canaan would be. Have your class turn to page 67, I think it is, page 67 in their personal study guide. Have them look under verse 53 for the explanation, and they'll find this. It's found in your leader's guide. After ridding the land of its current inhabitants and destroying all vestiges of their pagan worship practices, only then could the Israelites take possession of the land. This meant the land they would inhabit would not be the same as what was there now. Now listen to the thoroughness of this. Its culture, belief systems, religious practices, values, government, and social organization were to be transformed. That's how thoroughly it's supposed to happen. Now, just imagine you go back to your hometown, and everything looks like what it was, and yet everything's different about that place. This is what's supposed to happen. This is how thorough they are to be in terms of cleansing the land. Now, you'll notice the application point for this point. It is following God often requires believers to remove potential distractions. So that's what I want to concentrate in terms of the application of this point, this idea of distractions. Remember what the prize was. The prize for them was the promised land. But the prize for you and me is following after God. We follow God because He's what's most important to us. We follow God because we want to be like Jesus. So if God's the most important thing to you, and becoming like Jesus is the most important thing, what are we going to do about distractions? Because distractions are always pulling us away from making God most important in our life and for us achieving to be like Jesus. So I want to give them some suggestions about distractions, and I want to get their feedback on how these things could be practiced. For example, one distraction: recognize the distractions. When the people enter the land, they will recognize the distractions. And so I'm asking them, for you and me to be able to fully follow God, what are some of the distractions that we face that are always pulling us away from this goal? And if they need some help, I just simply say, what are some technology things that are always distracting us? You may have been hearing how distracted our children are by their smartphones and how shaping it is to their lives. What about worries? What worries? What about busyness? What about entertainment? My point is, I'm trying to help them think through their lives. What are the distractions that we encounter that keep us from following God fully? Because these things were going to be distractions to the Israelites. A second thing that I see in this text that keeps us from following God fully that would be helpful is to prioritize your relationship with God. He was to be most important. So how can you put God first in your routine? I want the class to answer that question. And by the way, never diminish simple changes. Simple changes are what eventually build into dramatic changes in our lives. If a family just made this simple change, as a family, we're going to have prayer for our meals. We're going to thank God for this meal. Just that simple change in many families could lead to other more dramatic changes. But that would just be a way of prioritizing your relationship with God as a family. Maybe before you go to bed at night, the family gathers and just has a simple prayer. I mean, nothing extensive, nothing that's involved, just a simple prayer, thanking God for the day and asking for his guidance for tomorrow. Never diminish simple things. Those things can lead to greater things. A third thing that I see in this text that we can draw from it, and that is ruthlessly maintain boundaries. Ruthlessly. They were to be ruthless with these people. They were to drive out all the inhabitants of the land. There was not to be a Canaanite left in the land. There was not to be a stone image or a cast image that was to be left in the land. These things were horribly wicked. The high places were on tops of mountains, and they would build these altars there. And the pagan gods were voyeuristic. The way the pagans understood their gods is they believed that they engaged in sexual activity. This would stimulate the gods to be involved in sexual activity, and the sexual activity of the gods would result in crops and abundance and all of those kinds of things. It was a horribly, horribly wicked belief and religious system. And they are to take all of that despicable behavior and actions and completely rid the land of it. They were to maintain their boundaries. So what would be some examples of maintaining your boundaries? And to stimulate, if they need to be given some thought on that, is how about this one? How about just turning your phone off when you actually go to have a time to read the Bible and to pray, just for the purpose of not being tempted to check your email or responding to a ding when someone has texted you. Ruthlessly maintain boundaries. And the fourth thing, and this is all under the first point, replace distractions with spiritual practices. You see, they were going to remove all of those things, but what was to take place is the true things, the true practices that God had given them in those earlier chapters. And so what are some things that, when you get distracted, would be a practice you could implement that would help you remain focused on making God your first priority? That's the idea. I'm trying to make application of that in terms of this point. Following God often requires believers to remove potential distractions. Now, the second point is the task, and that's Numbers 33, verses 54 to 56. So as we read this, I'm asking the class, what's the problem people have with the task? I don't mean necessarily the Israelites, but when people read this text, what is it that they're troubled by? And then secondly, what's at stake if they don't? So you read the text, and what many people are concerned about is this appears to be an act of genocide. And so you're going to need to have an explanation for that on how to respond to the fact that these people are to be driven out of the land. And I mean, every single one of them, they're to be spewed out of the land. And so have an answer. But to understand that, you need to know the consequences. And so then I want the class to begin to list the consequences that are in this passage of Scripture. For example, verse 55, if you don't drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, those you allow to remain will become barbs for your eyes. Now think about what that must mean. Barbs for your eyes. What would happen to you if you were to lose your eyesight? It would be a devastating loss. Think how different your world would become if you were to lose your eyesight. It's a powerful picture that he's trying to convey. And then he says thorns for your side. It's more of the idea of constant nagging and irritation. And the outcome would be devastation for the people of God. And then he goes on to say, those who you allow to remain will become barbs for your eyes and thorns for your sides. They will harass you in the land where you live. And the word harass there means a narrow space. It's almost like imprison you. This was to be a place where they experienced freedom and they could spread out and they could experience the fullness of what God had for them. But if they don't do something about these people, if they compromise this, these people are going to restrict them and imprison them and harm them. And so what I'm trying to do with these consequences, I'm trying to make it as bad as it possibly can be. Because so if they don't carry out the task, the consequences are devastating. Notice, he says, and what I had planned to do to them, I will do to you. And it is exactly what happened. Many scholars, rabbis believe this was fulfilled in the Babylonian exile. They were expelled from the land. So my point that I'm trying to do when I'm talking about this is I'm trying to help them see how powerful it is going to be the consequences if they don't obey God. Now, what does this mean for us when it comes to obedience? Believers can expect to encounter challenges while following God. That's the application point. So I think one of the principles that's being stated about obedience here is we need to be wholehearted in our obedience. So what's an example of selective compliance on the part of Christians today? And you might want to have an idea to just kind of prime the pump for them. But what he's driving at here is wholehearted obedience. But selective compliance has these devastating impacts. We don't see it that way, but it really does have devastation. We don't know the fullness of God. So my first thing I'm trying to do in terms of applying it is what's wholehearted obedience look like? Secondly, a life of obedience means separating from influences that lead away from God. So on one hand, the passage is talking about wholehearted obedience. On the other hand, it's talking about separating from influences that lead away from God. Now, occasionally, I will send my daughters and their husbands books or articles or videos that I think are particularly helpful, and not just to me, but would be helpful to them, particularly at their point in life, raising my grandchildren. And I have a very big investment in that. And so from my perspective, I think it would be good for them to listen to the things that I'm sending them. And I'm wanting to be a good and a godly influence on them. So I'm going to ask the class, which is primarily my age. Now, there are younger ones in there, but primarily my age. What areas should my children, their children, pay attention in light of these verses? What areas should they pay attention to? Because we're talking about challenges to their obedience, distractions to their obedience. So I want them to be wholehearted. I want them to separate away from any influences that would distract them from God. So what are those areas that would diminish their wholehearted commitment to God, that would influence them to be distracted from God? That's what I'm driving at. And again, here just some things I would suggest that if they were in a position to advise my children or their children, for example, friendships. Everyone understands the influence of friends on teenagers. It's not just teenagers, it's all of us. Tell me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you'll be 5 years from now. Friendships are very powerful in terms of their influence, in terms of influencing us toward God or away from God. How about another area is media? How does media influence us to be wholehearted or to be influenced to be separated from God? I would want to talk to my children about their habits. Habits are something that can be powerfully effective in producing good in our lives. But we also know of habits that are powerful in affecting bad in people's lives. A fourth area for me that I would mention is time. Time is the commodity you cannot save. It has to be spent. And so it's very important that you keep the priorities of your life in front of you, and you give time to those things. So that's what I'm driving. I'm trying to re-emphasize this idea that God's plans, which are perfect, require believers to act on the instructions he gives. Now, the last point is the plan. Chapter 34, verses 13 through 19. It is, the context is Gad and Reuben and half the tribe of Manasseh, which was a huge tribe, request that they stay on the east side of the Jordan River instead of crossing over and taking possession of some of the promised land. And you can read this story, how it caused a lot of conflict. Moses thought, oh my goodness, they're doing it again. They're not wanting to go into the promised land, and we're going to go on another trip through the wilderness. And they clarify, no, that's not it at all. It's just that this land is very good for our herds. And many commentators feel like that these tribes were doing wrong. All of the description of the promised land, the boundaries of the promised land are on the west side of the Jordan River, not on the east side. When it comes to the time when the kingdom is split after Solomon dies, you discover that these tribes no longer exist. It's Midianites and Amorites that are there. So these tribes have somehow gone away. And so when it comes to being attacked, these will be the people who are attacked first by the enemies. And so many commentators believe that these people are doing wrong. Others see it as an expansion of the promised land and the fact that Moses approved. I don't know which one it is, but we're just simply stated the obvious truth that they asked to be handed this land. There's a handout that's in your leader's guide that you will find valuable. It's pack item 12, and it asks this question: why this land? Because this land has no gold or silver, which would have been valuable in that day, has no oil in our day. And why this land? And so that article would be something you'd want to share with your class. Now, the application point, again, that helps us know how to take this and use it to the value of our class says we can trust God to keep his promises. And so this is a very powerful motivator for me to continue in my ministry. This statement, we can trust God to keep his promises. If I doubted that, I promise you I would quit today. If that's not true, I'm not going to continue doing what I'm doing. Let me give you an example of the reasons why. I stand before families who have lost their loved ones, and I intend to give them hope and to point them to Jesus Christ. And what I deliver to them in a message at that funeral are the promises of God and the assurance that God keeps his promises for their loved one, if their loved one has died in Jesus Christ, and he keeps his promises for them to never leave them nor forsake them. Now, if this is not true, then I'm going to quit. But it is true. What motivates them? What motivates me to stay faithful, to be in obedience to God? That's the question I have for the class. And I'm looking for answers like, well, it's the hope that we find in God's promises. It's the assurance we find in God's promises. It's the encouragement we find in God's promises. God's promises are what makes our life full and meaningful. And the list could go on. So that's the way I'm trying to apply the lesson. Now, to wrap the lesson up, I'm going to pull out my iPhone and I'm going to give them an explanation about how you can use the iPhone to find your way back to camp. I'm a deer hunter, and Sometimes I get out into the woods and I can't see clearly the way back, and my iPhone the compass on the iPhone will help me find my way out of the hills back to camp. And so I'm going to explain to them how they can use their compass on their smartphone to find their way back home. Now, the point of that is simply to say the compass will give me accurate information. It will instruct me in the direction I need to go. But I got to act on it. And that's what this lesson is about. God gives us perfect instruction. He requires us to act on it. And we can know the fullness that God has for us. But brothers and sisters, as an act of faith, we must obey. This is a wonderful lesson, a powerful lesson, one that you'll want to really communicate clearly to your class, that so much of the blessings of God hinge upon us simply obeying the instructions of God. I'm excited for you. I'm praying for you as you teach this lesson. God bless you.